DraftSociety.com presents a Premier League Draft Fantasy Podcast. Welcome to the Key Pass Collective, your exclusive source for the information, analysis, and advice you need to dominate your fantasy leagues. Come on in. We've been expecting you.
What's going on, draft heads? Welcome back to the Key Pass Collective. My name's Joe Williams. The Key Pass Collective is your audio companion to the Draft Society website. Check out the Draft Society if you would. It's got all of the resources that you will need to dominate the Draft Premier League fantasy game. Today, we are here to discuss a few stat categories that are going to be pretty integral to success in this draft game. So we're actually going to bring back a bit of evergreen content, evergreen for the most part, because in this conversation, you will hear a couple player names that are mentioned that are probably no longer relevant. Moise Kean being the prime example here. But for the most part, this conversation with the founders of Overthinking Football, which is a blog that is incredibly focused on the statistical aspects of this game, they release many metrics. The one we talk about in this episode is expected fantasy points, but they also have metrics for WAR, which is wins above replacement, which will be hopefully re-releasing that episode here very soon. But this particular one, expected fantasy points. However, in this episode, we also get into points per game, points per 90, XA, XG, and we really talk through all of those metrics and get a good understanding of what they do well and what they don't do well. So if you've ever been a person who has struggled to sort of comprehend or really wrap your brain around the statistical aspect of a lot of these numbers that you're seeing here and there, this is going to be a really good episode for you. This is one to definitely listen to, maybe listen to a couple times. So Overthinking Football and the brilliant brains over there, this is the first of our episodes with them, and hopefully I'll be re-releasing the other ones here coming up soon. Again, this is a re-release, so please excuse anything that is a bit dated, but Overthinking Football is still at it, and they're releasing some incredible content with the rumor of a potential app coming out this year as well. So wait on that and keep checking back to see any progress on that front. But without any further ado, let's go ahead and get into it. For a further explanation of expected fantasy points, XA, XG, points per 90, points per game, and a whole bunch more, stay tuned. Here is Overthinking Football. So I am joined by Chris from Overthinking Football. If you've not been there yet, there's a blog that he and, is it Will?
Will, and we have one more, a guy called Andy. Yeah, he's a little shy, so he's hidden from the site currently.
All right, so the three of them run a blog, which is overthinkingfootball.com, and it's very, very statistic-driven analysis of this fantasy game that we play, which, you know, the stronger minds among us definitely appreciate that. I know that the reason I wanted to highlight you guys was because when your article, specifically the one on expected fantasy points, came out, I was super intrigued. But at the time, I remember skimming over it. And then at the time, I was like, oh, this is probably really useful, but I can't think that hard right now. So now, 2 months later or whatever, since you put it out, I got to thinking and I was like, actually, I think the community sort of glossed over that article, unfortunately. I think it didn't quite get the acclaim maybe, or at least the attention that it deserved, because I think there's some really, really interesting information and some really helpful information for fantasy managers within your model that you've created. So we're going to have to start from the beginning, if that's okay, Chris.
Yeah,
and we're going to have to kind of talk through it. So first of all, okay, walk me through, and remember, our audience is super intelligent, I'm sure, but talk to me like I'm a layman and just pretend that I know absolutely nothing about math or anything like that. So why are fantasy points per game and even like fantasy points per 90, why are those not strong indicators of fantasy value for our players?
Yeah, so I think that's a great question. I think it sort of goes to the foundation of why we decided to even come up with this statistic. So the statistic is expected fantasy points, as you mentioned. And so there's sort of two big pieces that went into the motivation in creating that. And so the first big piece is the fact that on the Fantrax website, when they do the summary statistics for a player, they give you the fantasy points per game. And so the problem with a per game metric is because it doesn't take into account substitution appearances. Or in fact, it takes into account substitution appearances too much.
Exactly. So yeah. It does take into account.
Yeah. But it shouldn't take it into account. And so I like to use extreme examples to sort of walk through these ideas. And so the most extreme example is you have a guy who only plays 1 minute in some game. And if he plays 2 games total, one game he starts, he plays 90 minutes, he scores, let's say 20 points. That's a really amazing output.
Huge.
And so just on that single game basis, he would have 20 fantasy points per game. So that's, it's a small sample size. We don't know if that's a great representation of his actual ability. But then if you imagine he plays a second game where he only gets subbed in and he plays a single minute, a single minute's not really enough to accumulate any fantasy points. And if you then go back and calculate the fantasy points per game, because he now has 2 games under his belt, he then has 20 fantasy points across 2 games. So that gives you a 10-point per game average.
Right. And hopefully people can already see what's wrong with this.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. It's hugely skewed, and really even a single substitution appearance can radically skew the fantasy point per game statistic. So it doesn't do a good job of giving a summary of what a player's actual ability is.
So then many people then said, okay, well, then we just need to start calculating fantasy points per 90 because it's a better representation of what that player does in their time on the pitch. Yes. Now we have the other side of the coin. What's wrong with that?
Yeah, so I actually think so fantasy points per 90 is a good metric, and it's significantly better than fantasy points per game. The reason why we opted against points per 90 is because, again, it takes into account substitution appearances, which would normally be okay. And this is a pretty minor point. But there has been some data to show that substitute appearances have increased XG. So essentially, the idea is that substitutes coming in, especially like imagine a forward, probably the most likely position to be substituted depending on the team. Yeah. So they're going against tired legs. So you have a fresh guy coming in. He is much more likely to perform well, to score goals than a forward who's been playing the entire game at that point. So there's a really great article by StatsBomb where they basically look at the XG output of subs versus starters. And they just find that there's an increase in XG in substitutes. So by including the sub minutes, you're including essentially playing time where this player is performing differently than he would were he starting the game. And this is normally okay, but ultimately when we're playing fantasy sports, we've looked into this briefly, but it seems like there's almost never a good reason to start somebody in your lineup who is a substitute for their actual game.
Exactly.
So if you never want to start a sub in your actual lineup, then you really aren't interested in how they perform as a substitute. I mean, the only exception is like 2018, 2019, Adama Traore, who just crushed it as a sub. And there might be some argument for starting a guy like him, but there's like only 1 or 2 examples of that kind of a player. So yeah, it goes back to, if you're going to start a guy, you always want to start a guy who's playing, because playing time equals opportunity. And as a result, you're only interested in how do they perform when they actually start, because it is a slightly different performance than that player would yield if he was subbing in instead.
Precisely. So yeah, so to say it a different way, I mean, there's a handful of guys in the league that I would want to start as a sub. I can think of like 2 or 3 City guys and maybe Traore if he's not starting. And when you are trying to figure out a player's value and you want a number that is representative of that player's value, whether it's points per 90, whether it's points per game, you don't actually care, or you don't want it to. I should say, you don't want it to include his substitute minutes, because we've seen time and again in this game, in the fantasy game that we play, that you don't start subs to begin with. So really the numbers that they score when they sub in are irrelevant.
Exactly. That's a perfect summary of the issue with points per 90. It skews the distribution of their points because it just, they have an increased likelihood of scoring.
So does points per 90 then overvalue sub appearances, or is it just that we don't care about those, to put it bluntly?
Well, so we don't care about sub appearances for the most part. I mean, this is a generalization.
Right.
There are certain circumstances where you do care about the sub minutes, but if you have a player who gets a bunch of starts, so you have a lot of data with which you can use to estimate their value, then points per 90 will essentially inflate their value because they include substitution appearances where they have this increased likelihood of scoring.
Right. Okay. And so for a long time, I was trying to get the Fantrax management to get us a points per 90 tab in the game. And then I sort of started spending more time trying to comprehend this blog post that you've posted. Remember, I'm terrible at math, so it's taking me some time to work through it. But and then I was like, wait, maybe I don't actually need a points per 90 column actually in the end, I really just don't actually, it doesn't help me very much. Well,
I wouldn't go that far. I think that points per 90 has a ton of value. It's still miles better than points per game is. So it's easier to calculate than something like expected fantasy points that we do. So I don't want to completely discount points per 90. And I think that it would certainly be an improvement on what exists currently on the Fantrax website. We just figured, if we're already going to be making these decisions with how we calculate a new statistic, we might as well try and do the absolute best job we can.
Right. So, because points per game is if your boss, did your employee review based upon the total number of hours in a day, even when you're sleeping, and your boss was like, all right, well, you really could have done a lot better this year. You had all these minutes here where you were sleeping and you didn't have any output then, and there was no productivity during those times when you were sleeping, and you were like, how could I help that? I was sleeping. That's the same as these players getting penalized for just sitting on the bench.
Yeah, I think that's a good analogy.
It's a broad generalization. It's okay. It's all right. So then previously you mentioned the idea of XG, and I know there were a few people online this last week, or maybe it was the week before, but there was a brief discussion about XG and what it is. So do you want to just run through XG and XA really quick and just tell people what those metrics are?
Sure. So first of all, there's a number of different ways to calculate these statistics. So, depending on your source, there might be a different specific way that they've gone about doing this. But ultimately, every time you see XG or you see XA, it's an estimate of how many goals you would expect to score from some opportunity. So if you have a player who takes a shot, if they have an XG that's assigned of 0.1, then essentially what that says is if this player were to take this same exact shot 10 times from this position, with this angle, with this goalkeeper position, with all the different variables. So if he repeats this shot, you would expect that 10% of the time the ball would go in the net. So it's essentially a probability of scoring given the situation surrounding a shot. So that is XG.
From an average player.
From an average player, yeah. I mean, I think so they take historical data. They look at basically, so I don't know the exact methodology, but I think that they sort of train a model. They look at all these different opportunities across all these different leagues with specific shots and positioning, and they use that to estimate the probability just based on how often those situations tend to go in.
Right.
So it is trained. It is supposed to represent an average player. I think one problem already that kind of creeps up there is what exactly is the definition of an average player?
Sure.
Is it an average player in MLS? Is it an average player in the Premier League? And
Same thing, basically. Yeah.
There's obviously a huge gap in ability between those two sets of players.
Right.
So I think it is a little hazy what exactly an average player is. I don't know this specifically. I would assume that they calculate it based on data from the Big Five leagues, but I don't know that 100%.
Yeah, I don't either.
And so XA is sort of the assist equivalent to XG. And to my understanding, XA is essentially the XG of the shot assigned to the player who passed the ball. So if a player has a 10% chance of scoring a goal, then the player who passed him the ball also has a 10% chance of getting an assist.
Oh, interesting. Okay, that's easy.
Yes, I believe that's correct. Everything I say should be double checked for the record.
I mean, it's okay because we're creeping up to your specific metric in the first place, and XG and XA are a part of that, but not the whole story.
Yes.
So right. So basically, a player then after a match is assigned an XG and an XA based upon their performance, and this should tell people, viewers, fantasy managers, coaches, scouts, this should tell people essentially how many goals and how many assists they should have had, or approximately, during that match. So what does it mean if you outperform your XA and XG, and what does it mean if you underperform?
Yeah, so that's a good summary. So basically, if a player takes 10 shots, that means that they have 10 XG opportunities. And at the end of the game, you can just add up all their XG, and that gives you an estimate of how many goals is this player expected to score in this game. And so overperformance and underperformance in this context is essentially, if a player has one opportunity where they accumulate 0.1 XG and they score a goal, that's technically overperformance. I mean, you cannot score increments of goals.
Right.
But this player is scoring a goal when he's not really expected to score a goal. If a player would accumulate 1 XG over a game and he scored 1 goal, then he's performing exactly as expected. He scored in that game goals at the rate that you would expect to see goals.
Right.
So this is important to note, though, is that these stats, on a per game basis, they might be tough to have good estimates, but across a season, a player's XG and actual goals should line up generally pretty well.
Exactly. So that one goal that they scored where it was a 0.1 XG and they probably shouldn't have scored that goal and they sort of got lucky, that's going to even out throughout the season as they do capitalize on the chances that they're supposed to make.
Right. And I think this is an important point is, like, let's say a player in 10 games, a player has 0.1 XG in every game, while on a single game basis, there's a 90% chance he doesn't score. You would expect in at least one of those games that he does in fact score a goal. So, it's a somewhat random process actually scoring goals based on the XG. But over time, you expect it to average out to approximately the same number.
Sometimes it doesn't.
Yes.
Like, for example, Jamie Vardy has taken a lot of crap in the fantasy community for constantly outperforming his XG, and everybody said he had to come down to earth. And arguably last season he did. But I mean, at least for a stretch, right? But still ended up with the golden boot. So it's like, how, if you have a player like Vardy, I mean, is he just, he's not lucky. Is he just world class?
Yeah. So, like we mentioned before, XG is measuring what would you expect an average player to do. So in Jamie Vardy's case, it could very well be that he's just not an average finisher. He could be an extraordinary finisher, and as a result, he scores goals consistently at a higher pace than his XG would suggest.
Okay.
So this is really important because it means that, XG is not the be-all, end-all, some players are in fact better than XG models would suggest. And I think that, you look at teams like Liverpool, players like Salah and Mane, these are exceptional players. And as a result, it would not be surprising if they consistently outperform what XG would predict.
Sure.
But I also think it's important to note that in order to actually tell if a player is truly better than XG, you need to establish a pretty large sample size. So, if a player outperforms XG across like 3 seasons or underperforms XG across 3 seasons, it's really not enough to know that they are an exceptional player or just super lucky. And so you really need to establish a large sample size to know for sure. And so if you don't know, if there's not enough data, I think in Jamie Vardy's case, don't quote me on this, but I feel like there's probably enough data to suggest he's better. But I think someone like Christian Benteke comes to mind. I mean, his past 3 seasons have been bad finishing wise. But before that, I mean, he scored 15 goals, 10 goals, 9 goals. I mean, the guy is capable of scoring. And when in doubt, I would hedge my bets towards a player reverting back to what you would expect, and that the underperformance or overperformance are just blips on the radar.
Right. Okay. So then that's where we have to sort of bring in this idea of, okay, but the game that we play, for those of us using Fantrack's default scoring or, customized scorings that are not the official Premier League scorings, there are other ways that players attain points. And so your argument for Benteke is certainly valid in terms of XG and XA, but then players are going to be like, yeah, but he's a goal scoring machine for Fantrax. So what do we do with that data?
Yeah, so essentially we recognize that there's a ton of random things that go on in a given game. And if we can smooth over the randomness as best as we possibly can, we're going to try and do that. And so one way to smooth over the randomness is looking at goals and assists, where people have metrics to describe what you would expect to see given a performance that there was no luck involved. For other points, like the ghost points that Benteke really thrives on, there aren't really like aerial models. Like how many aerials do you expect a player to get?
Right.
And as a result, if we had that data, you bet we would include that in our expected fantasy points. But we don't have that data. And also these points I would suspect are a lot more consistent. Again, the number of aerials you get is probably less influenced by luck. It's certainly strongly influenced by the opponent and play style, but like whether you actually win an aerial is probably a lot less dependent on luck than, say, finishing a goal from a tight angle might be.
Sure.
And so for those types of categories in our expected fantasy points, we just completely leave them alone.
Okay.
So essentially, the only points that we're actually modifying by an expected value are the goals and assists and clean sheets.
Okay. Got it. So then for those uninitiated to any of these stat categories, we've sufficiently sort of like laid down the base layer. So let's talk now about your model and specifically spend some time on discussing your threshold of 60 minutes, because I think this is one of the reasons why you guys are doing the legwork for us. I love this model because you only use players who start and play 60 minutes.
Yeah. So going back to the first point at the beginning of this interview, we're only using start data. So that's really important. So everything we do is per start. The other decision we made, and this was initially to control for clean sheets, but we did a limit of each player has to play at least 60 minutes for that game to be counted. We thought this made sense because defenders can only get clean sheets if they play 60 minutes. So this could really radically skew the points that a defender gets if we allow defenders to only play, say, 45 minutes.
Yeah.
And then our other rationale was we want games that are representative of a player's actual value. And for the most part, if a player isn't playing 60 minutes, then something happened. Maybe they got hurt. Maybe something in the game happened. They went down 3 goals early, and then maybe a defender comes off for a midfielder. we figured that this would help control for outside factors like that might affect a player. So we don't want to measure the propensity of a player to get injured. So, you could certainly argue that a 45-minute threshold would make more sense, and we're open to feedback. We've actually calculated this stat for a number of different minute thresholds, but we thought 60 made a lot of sense because it helped control for those basically uncontrollable events that could affect a player.
Now that you say that, though, I mean, I would be interested in an XI category where we're, tracking expected injuries among different players. And I'm just trying to think in my head right now, who would rank pretty highly on that list. Andy Carroll's got to be up there. But okay.
Yeah.
So then tell us a little bit about, I guess just kind of walk us through your model and the types of numbers that people who visit your blog are going to be seeing and interacting with, and then how we can use those to sort of help us to properly value players.
Sure. Basically the stat is computed by taking all of the players' points, all of their statistics. You leave all the quote unquote ghost points alone. And then you scale the goals by XG instead. So if a player accumulates 0.9 XG in a game and scores one goal, instead of giving him the points for that one goal, we only give him the points for 0.9 of a goal. So 0.9 times 9 or whatever your goal scoring category is. Then we do the exact same procedure for assists. I think it's important to note here that XA is only capturing official assists rather than fantasy assists.
Yeah.
So fantasy assists will be slightly downweighted. We're thinking about ways to try and take that into account. But this is something important to note when thinking about expected fantasy points. We also scale clean sheets. We essentially look at the XG that a team conceded, and then we sort of set different thresholds for what XG is considered a clean sheet or not.
Sure. And
then we use that, multiply it by the XG against the clean sheet points to get an estimate of what their expected clean sheet points would be in a given game based on the opponent's XG.
Oh, got it. Based upon the opponent's XG. Okay.
Exactly.
Okay, that makes sense.
So, for instance, if a team accumulates 1 XG against another team, like that team could very well have a clean sheet. I mean, we've seen, looking at the data, there are games where a team concedes 2 XG to the opponent but still has a clean sheet.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
So there's definitely some wiggle room there. So we essentially, I think it's like between 0.5 and 1.5, we consider full clean sheets. We scale it between 0.5 and 1.5 XG against, basically to try and take that into account that, based on how much XG they concede, this is how many clean sheet points they probably ought to get. And looking at the expected clean sheets compared to the actual clean sheet numbers across the entire season, it actually looks pretty good. It's pretty well calibrated. Most players score around the same number of expected clean sheets as they do actual clean sheets, which
Interesting.
Is what we were hoping to find.
Yeah, because I was just about to ask you, since the numbers are more geared toward the output of attacking players, whether or not, then using that to sort of try to figure out defensive players and their clean sheet capabilities would be as accurate or not.
Yeah, and this is actually data that we have available. So on the website, we have the ranking page, and we have a downloadable spreadsheet that has all the data, such as expected clean sheets, total clean sheets, as well as the full fantasy, the true fantasy points, as opposed to the expected fantasy points.
And those are updated constantly.
We update them. So we've updated them with the new scoring, and then we plan on updating them throughout the season.
Perfect.
So the one downside is you really need a sample size that's big enough to feel confident in the estimates you're making. So that should always be taken into account. For instance, if you have a player that's like, if you're looking at the past season, a player like Moise Keane, who performed incredibly well in the 6 games he started by XG. He didn't finish his opportunities, but he produced a ton of XG. He scores really, really well. But it's not clear, did he have a really nice 6-game streak of XG, or Is he the type of player who consistently gets himself into great positions?
Right.
And so that's just something that's tough to tell when you only have 6 games to work with. So I encourage anyone listening who's planning on using expected fantasy points to bear in mind the number of starts a player has, because the fewer starts, obviously, the less confident you can be in the estimate. But that goes for fantasy points per game. That goes for every one of these metrics.
Right. Yeah. So, and some players might have had an outlier game that they'll never match, or a particular stinker of a game that is not representative of their actual skill.
Exactly.
On the field. Okay, great. So I'm looking at on overthinkingfootball.com. This is just the xFpts rankings page, just your kind of, I guess this is what do you want to call it? Like the flagship kind of homepage for the rankings.
Yeah.
And this is where you have, all of the player rankings, regardless of category, regardless of position on the field. And we're seeing some, basically, you've got on the left-hand side here, mean expected fantasy points rank. You see a lot of players that you're used to, and then you see some players that sort of stick out and are a little bit funny. You already mentioned Moise Kean at number 18 overall. So explain to me, like, what do I do with this data now? Because I'm looking at this list and I'm like, oh, I need to go pick up Moise Kean. Like, what do I do? How do I properly use this data to be a better manager?
Sure. So I think on a weekly basis, if you have if you're looking at the waiver wire and you want to know, okay, I have 2 players and I need to start one of them because my starters are injured or what have you. You almost always want to pick the player who has the higher mean expected fantasy points, assuming that they're starting. So that's a really important designation here, is that these points, they're mean expected fantasy points. These are the mean points that they are expected to score in games where they actually start. So if a player is not starting, obviously that's not what we're concerned about. So this is only taking into account when they start. So it's valuable in assessing 2 different players, what you would expect them to perform if they were both starting a given game. So I think it's very valuable for the waiver wire for picking up players, and it's very valuable for forming ranks when it comes to drafts.
Yeah, I was just going to say, yeah, absolutely.
We have another metric that we definitely don't have time to talk about, the WAR score.
I would love to have you back on and talk about that.
Yeah, I'd be happy to talk about it. So I mean, I think the WAR score is probably a little bit better for actual full draft rankings, because the WAR score takes into account playing time, which I think if the expected fantasy points really tells us anything, it's that everything is about opportunity. So a player who puts himself into opportunities to accumulate more XG, that's the type of player that's going to score more often. And so that's sort of directly what the expected fantasy points is trying to measure. Whereas the standard fantasy points, they don't really measure opportunity. They just measure the actual end result, which is a lot more variable because there's a lot more luck involved in how many you actually finish. And I think there's a lot less luck involved in how often are you putting yourself into opportunities, into positions where you have really good chances. And because those are the types of players that will be more consistent moving forward. Because again, you could have one game where you get incredibly lucky, but luck is not a consistent trait.
Correct.
Whereas, positional awareness, putting yourself into good spaces on the field, that is something that the great players just do consistently, and they do it consistently well.
Right.
I think a really great example of that is Robert Lewandowski, who he actually doesn't outperform XG at all. His XG is pretty much right in line with his goals, but he knows how to find the spaces and he knows how to get good shots. And as a result, he scores a ton of goals. So you don't even need to outperform your XG in order to be a quality player. You just need to get good opportunities.
Interesting. So his XG must just be very, very high.
It is very high. I mean, Bayern obviously run train on the rest of the Bundesliga.
Yeah.
But I think it's indicative of the idea that opportunities are a lot more important than the actual finishes you made when looking forward.
Okay. So as people are looking at the rankings page here, And as they're kind of like scrolling through it, let's just help them just in case, because people might get a little bit overwhelmed. You've got a few different columns here. You already talked us through the mean expected fantasy points, and that is on a per game basis. Is that right?
That's correct. So that's, you take all, for every game that this player has started. So Kevin De Bruyne started 32 games. We have how many expected fantasy points he scored in every single one of those games. And this mean expected fantasy points is just the average number of expected fantasy points that he scores per game.
Right, based upon the positions he puts himself in and the sort of types of assists that he sends into the box or whatever.
Exactly.
Okay. All right, and then obviously I think total expected fantasy points is, again, fairly obvious. That's like throughout for the whole season, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Those are in the games he started. So it's basically the mean expected fantasy points times the game started.
Okay. So then the column in between that's the one.
Yes.
Explain that one to me. It's SD X fantasy points.
The label could maybe be better. So this is the standard deviation. So the standard deviation is essentially a measure of, on average, how much does this player's, I'm trying to think how to describe it. To what degree the player's points vary. So if a player every single week scored the exact same amount of points, his standard deviation would be 0 because he always scores exactly this many points.
Mm-hmm.
So the lower the standard deviation is, the less variable his mean point total is. So very, very consistent if you're always scoring the same number of points, obviously.
Sure.
So the standard deviation is a measure of consistency. You can this is not technically correct, but it's a good way to think about it. You can basically think of it as plus or minus. So like Kevin De Bruyne on a per game basis is expected to score 19 plus or minus 9 expected fantasy points because his standard deviation is 9.
Right. So so I mean, if you pick someone off the waiver wire and you pick up, I'm surprised to see Bruno Fernandes actually how high his standard deviation is, but it's at 8, and so he has a mean expected fantasy points of 14, and then his standard deviation is 8. So if let's say you're in some league where last year where people, for some reason, Bruno Fernandes was not 100% owned, and he wasn't for the longest time, and it was maddening to me. But you pick him up, and you're expecting these, 14 points a match. You shouldn't be upset when he doesn't get you that because the standard deviation should have told you that in the first place.
Yeah, exactly. And I think sort of the way to use the standard deviation. So this goes for deciding between 2 starters or deciding on who you want to pick up on the waiver wire. Let's say that you have 1 player left to play and your opponent is ahead by, say, 20 points. And he has nobody left. So this is a pretty big gap to make up. You might want a player like, let's say, it's a good example, somebody with a high standard deviation. Bruno Fernandes, his expected fantasy points are 14, but his standard deviation is 8. You might prefer to start him, even though he averages fewer expected fantasy points than someone like, it's a good example, than someone like David Silva or Adama Traore, who they average more expected fantasy points, but their standard deviation is much lower. So if you need a home run, it's going to be less likely to come from those guys than it is. Okay, I got you. So it's really, in some ways, it's a measure of boom or bust capacity. So higher standard deviations mean higher boom or bust potential. So you shouldn't be surprised if they score very lowly in a given week. But it's also not unreasonable to expect a humongous performance. Yeah,
it's also based on what they've previously shown us that they're capable of. And their previous performances. Yeah, for sure. Great. So, okay. I think that, at least in terms of utilizing the I don't know if you want to call it like the chart here, you can sort by any column you want to. I think that clears it up a lot for me on how to use it and how to make, I guess, my decisions based upon this particular metric that you've come up with. I'm curious, when you sort of started utilizing this and making all the calculations and seeing where players ended up, what surprised you? What were some of the things that you took away from this whole process?
Yeah. I've always known that Gabriel Jesus was a really good player, but I guess I didn't quite realize how good. He performs almost exactly at his XG and XA would suggest he would, and it's just incredibly high. When Gabriel Jesus starts, I mean, this is not a hot take, but I mean, he is one of the absolute best players, and he's up there with Mahrez, with De Bruyne, as the types of guys that are just total game changers when they're in.
Yeah. No, I mean, it's okay. So that's not breaking news, but at the same time, like, listen, if I'm to tell you that you can pretty much at this point, pretty much plan on 20 games or more this season, maybe he gets more, of Gabriel Jesus scoring 17 points, maximum is going to be around 25, and the absolute bare minimum is going to be 10.
I mean, it's insane.
It's got to put him high up your ranks.
Yeah, so you have to really balance his playing time, which is what the War Score kind of tries to do. So he was a little surprising, only because he's not overperforming at all. He's properly performing, and his performance without going above and beyond his XG is already up at the top of the league. So he was a surprise. Somebody I want to mention is Trent Alexander-Arnold. So he actually doesn't do great in expected fantasy points.
Yeah, 25th overall.
Exactly, despite being the consensus top defender. And I think it's really important to note that, so Trent Alexander-Arnold gets a lot of points from assists. And again, these metrics are based on what do we expect the average player to do. So Trent Alexander-Arnold is not passing the ball to average forwards.
True.
Trent Alexander-Arnold is passing the ball to Mo Salah, to Sadio Mane, to Bobby Firmino. And as a result, his XA is almost definitely being undervalued here. So this is a really important point, because whenever you look at these players and you might be surprised by their positioning in this chart, you really need to take into account their context. This is a tool, not the be all end all. And that's one thing that you really need to think about is, okay, Trent Alexander-Arnold is low, but obviously you'd rather start Trent Alexander-Arnold than Christian Benteke in a given game. And this is because of the inherent limitations of XG and XA. The nice thing about that, though, is that it's kind of obvious who the guys are that are going to be undervalued by XG and XA. And they're really not the types of players that we are as interested in, because they're mainly no-brainer players.
Okay.
So like Mo Salah, again, Trent Alexander-Arnold, like it's obvious that he's a great fantasy asset. But this is really useful metric for players where it's not quite as obvious how good they really are. So I think Reece James is a really good example of that. Reece James comes in at 12th. We all know Reece James is a good fantasy defender, but the data would suggest that he's one of the absolute best fantasy defenders.
Right.
So it really helps you pick out players from teams that you maybe don't think about as much, or players who don't get to play as often, and so their fantasy points per game are a lot lower. It sort of helps you pick out those types of undervalued players. So I would be less concerned with the top end guys that we know are top end, and be more concerned with which middle of the pack standard fantasy point players are rising tremendously because of this.
Which is awesome too, because then them being average players, you can probably trust the XA and the XG to be more representative of their skill level.
Exactly. Yeah. So that's really where you can find value with this kind of data. Like João Cancelo is another great example.
Yeah, I just saw him on there. Yeah, that's a huge call.
He scores 20th overall. If the guy gets consistent playing time, he performs really, really well. And he's another candidate like Trent Alexander-Arnold, where his XA is probably worth more than the model would suggest, which you'd think would bump him up even higher.
Okay.
So I think that those middle of the pack, the underrated value is where this type of ranking helps the most.
Sure. And I mean, a lot of it is, it can also, I guess, how do I want to say? It can also confirm preconceived notions. Is sort of what you were saying already. But I look at a guy, who I'm looking around at the leagues and at the community, and I'm like, am I crazy for drafting X player in the third round? And in this particular case, I'm looking at Jared Bowen.
Yeah.
Who his standard deviation is incredibly low. I mean, just compared to a lot of the players around him. And he's still scoring decent points.
Yeah, no, exactly. I think that especially for things like that, if you have the intuition that a certain player you think is undervalued, I think that going back to this chart and seeing like, okay, well, when he started, how did he actually perform? And sort of skimming away the randomness that's inherent to actual goals and just seeing, well, what is he expected to do? I think this can, really help you determine whether you are properly rating a guy, whether the community is underrating a guy. And I think Jared Bowen is actually a great example of this, where, I mean, he performed really, really well in limited playing time for a bad team. And so you would think that his performances could only go up. And the expected fantasy points, I mean, he ranks 32nd overall, which, if you were drafting players only based on this as a 4th round pick for a 10 person league. I think 3rd round is good value for a guy like that, and expected fantasy points tends to agree with that assessment.
Yeah, absolutely. We may not be able to reunite before the drafts all happen.
Sure.
Do you want to give just a quick teaser of your WAR stat?
Sure. So
if Quick exists for that,
I'll do my best. You should really read the article because it's pretty. I think it's pretty thorough. And we're more than happy to answer questions via DMs, via emails. Guys should feel
at
free to
Overthinking Football.
At Overthink Football.
Overthink. My bad.
It's Overthinking Football is too long for Twitter to handle. No pun intended. Sounds
about right for Twitter.
WAR rankings. WAR is wins above replacement. This comes from a baseball statistic, where the idea is basically to measure how much value does a player have over the course of a season in terms of wins rather than in terms of points that they score. And so obviously the number of wins is calculated via the number of points that they score, but you can essentially look at the distribution of points that a player produces in a given season and estimate, well, if you were to replace this player with the league average player at that position, how many additional wins is your player of interest worth? If you look at the total number of wins a player in theory contributes to across a season, you get a measure of value for a specific player. And what's really important is that you only accumulate wins if you're actually playing in games. So it's scaled by the number of games actually started. And as a result, it gives a pretty good snapshot of the value that every player had for the previous season.
Yeah.
And so, like all of our tools, everything should be used with a healthy dose of your own intuition, especially, like I've said a million times, because opportunity is so important. The number of starts a player actually receives is possibly the most important statistic that there is for a given player. Because Amarez is super valuable if he plays 20 games, but he's practically useless if he plays 5.
Yeah.
So the WAR rankings takes that into account for the past season and estimates how many wins each player was responsible for above a replacement level player at that position.
Now, what's your threshold for a win? How do you calculate a win?
Yeah, so we run thousands of simulations.
Oh, this is where we need to have a separate podcast, isn't it? Okay.
So you basically you take an average starting lineup. So we've set the number of players that we're including for each starter, quote unquote, starter position. And then we simulate a bunch of games. We simulate a bunch of games with a quote unquote average lineup. And then we simulate a bunch of games with the average lineup with one of the players replaced by some guy you're interested in. And then you simulate thousands of games. And then you say, okay, well, how frequently did the team with my specific player of interest win the game?
Okay.
So if the lineup with that player inserted into the lineup wins, 60% of the time, that means that you have an increased win probability of 10% because, on average, two totally random lineups would be expected to win 50% of the time. So if the lineup with your specific player included wins 60% of the time, you have an increased probability of winning when that player is in the lineup.
Okay.
So you basically get a probability of a player winning a game when he's in your lineup. And so it's just like XG, that's your expected win for that game. And so then the expected wins times the number of games they start gives you an estimate of the number of wins that player is responsible for across the season.
Sure. Okay. And so the more players you have with the higher WAR, the better likelihood you have of winning more games.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. And so there's some stats you can use. I encourage you to read the article. There's some stats you can use in the article to try and project how much WAR a given player would get in the upcoming season that can be super valuable for making draft ranks.
Fantastic. Yeah, that's overthinkingfootball.com. Check it out. Obviously, for the expected fantasy points that we talked about for the majority of this interview here, that's on there, and they have pages that are specifically devoted to forwards, midfielders, and defenders with all of their ratings on there, as well as specifically, I don't know what you want to call this. Is this a cluster graph? Is this a line graph? I don't know graphs. I'm not a graph guy.
It's probably a scatter plot.
Scatter plot. Okay. So basically, it's telling you kind of like the mean expected fantasy points and the players who perform better and worse than their expected fantasy points consistently.
Yes.
So that's interesting too.
I will warn everyone, though, that those articles were written, I think, after game week 29 of last season. So the numbers themselves are out of date. But the introduction to expected fantasy points has an overview of how we calculate scores. And it's the method we use to calculate the expected fantasy point ranking that's on the page.
That's perfect. Chris, what's coming up for you guys? What's on the horizon?
Oh, man. We put in a lot of work for the expected fantasy points and for the WAR score. So we're still coming up with what we want to do next. We're trying to do a positional value article before the season starts. TBD if we actually get to that. But we're trying. We're thinking about doing an optimal lineup article because we have these simulations set up so that we can just have all the different possible starting lineups competing against one another, which might be kind of fun.
Right.
We're starting to post player distribution plots where essentially the mean score is not the best overview of how a player actually performs. You really want to know, well, what is the distribution of this guy's points? And so we're posting a bunch of plots over the next coming weeks.
Interesting. So is that not covered by standard deviation?
So it's going to get a little technical. So a standard deviation kind of assumes a normal distribution. And these players, the point distributions are normal adjacent. They're not quite normal.
Got it.
Because they all have, like, just about every player has a floor above 0 points. But a normal distribution wouldn't assume that. So yeah, the distributions can actually, for specific players, can be quite different than a normal distribution. We just posted a plot of Williams' distribution of points, and you can see that it's does not look like your classic bell curve.
No, not at all. Yeah, absolutely. I'm just looking at it now. It's more like a camel.
Yes, camel curve.
Yeah,
that's a technical term.
Right, exactly. I told you I'm a math guy.
Yeah.
No, that's great. And are you, I mean, is there any, I guess, is there any like agenda in terms of like which players you're going to be focusing on for that? Are you taking, God forbid, I don't want to open up your DMs to everybody, but are you taking requests on players?
We are taking requests. In fact, we strongly encourage requests because then we don't have to come up with the players that we pick. We already have a couple of requests, but yeah, everyone should feel free to message us if there's any specific players they want to see.
Cool. Yeah, I mean, community, check it out, honestly, because, as things were hot and heavy in the draft community, everybody's releasing mock drafts and everybody's releasing all these different things. And so, it's just really easy for things to go kind of under the radar. And I felt like this blog and the X fantasy points in particular was one of those things that sort of slipped by us because we were all so obsessed with looking at mock drafts, which really, what does that even tell you in the first? Like, let's be honest with each other. You look at somebody's mock draft, hey, rate my mock draft. Like, we all like to do it because it's fun, but none of us know how the season's going to end up. None of us know. I mean, it's all a gut call. So if you want a way to be able to utilize actual data and actual statistics in a better way than just, that team looks better than that team, like, give it, give this site a visit. So that's kind of why I wanted to have you on, Chris. I appreciate your time, man.
No, I appreciate you having me. And I hope you guys use the tools. Again, I think it's important to use these as tools, not as the word of God.
Be all end all, yeah.
And because a healthy dose of intuition, definitely when, you can't predict playing time, you can't predict what Pep might do with his rotations or how Lionel Messi's just going to blow up the league.
Right. Right.
But yeah, I think it's really helpful, and I think it can help you come up with your own draft rankings.
Wonderful. And we will, I'll DM you or something and try to figure out when we can get back on and talk about WAR a little bit more.
Awesome, man. Appreciate it.
All right. Appreciate it, brother. I'll talk to you soon.
Sounds good.
All right.
Bye.
Cheers.